Arizona Territory. May 1884. Heat shimmered off the sand like a curtain, and the wind carried only dust and silence. The white of her wedding dress was stained red with dust. Olivia Rawlins sat beside the deserted stone well, hands limp in her lap, curls stuck to her neck with sweat and tears. Her mouth was dry, too dry to cry anymore, too dry to even curse the man who had left her behind. An old mesquite tree cast a thin shadow across the well, barely enough to shield her from the sun. The freight wagon had passed hours ago. She had begged the driver to stay, but he had muttered something about not wanting to get involved, then cracked the reins, leaving her in a cloud of grit. Olivia had not moved since. Her satin shoes were ruined, her veil tangled in the wind. The desert stretched out around her, endless and cruel. She was alone. Then came the distant clop of hooves. She squinted. A lone rider was cutting across the sand, not in a hurry but steady, like he knew exactly where he was going. His horse was coated in dust, same as his coat, and a rifle was slung over his back. She did not have the strength to stand, so she watched him come closer, the sun haloing around his broad shoulders. He dismounted a few paces away, boots crunching toward her. His voice was rough but steady. "You all right, miss?" She blinked up at him. "Do I look all right?" He crouched, pulling a canteen from his saddlebag. "No. You look like you were about 10 minutes from passing out." She reached for the canteen with shaking hands. He held it steady while she drank, water spilling down her chin and soaking the bodice of her dress. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. When she finally pulled back, she whispered, "Thank you." He sat beside her in the dirt, legs stretched out, wiping sweat from his brow. "Name's Tobias Finch. Folks call me Toby. Olivia Rawlins." She stared at the cracked earth. "Or at least I was supposed to be Olivia Marston by now." He glanced at her dress, then at the empty stretch of desert road. "Let me guess. He left you right after the preacher finished the vows. Said he could not do it. Rode off with the money and left me standing there like a fool." Her voice cracked. "Was not even his horse. It was my father's." Tobias let out a breath. "That is cold." "My father died last year," she said. "Ma passed when I was little. No brothers. No sisters. Just me in a house I cannot run alone." "I am sorry," he said, quiet. She looked at him then, really looked. He was older than her by a few years, maybe 30, with sunburned skin and dark stubble along his jaw. His eyes were tired but kind. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Hunting mustangs," he said. "Saw your tracks near the old well. Figured I would check it." "I thought someone would come back," she said. "But no one did." "I came," he said simply. She looked away, blinking fast. He stood and offered her his hand. "You cannot stay out here. Come on. I will take you to my camp. I do not even know you. You are stranded in the middle of the desert in a wedding dress. What have you got to lose?" She hesitated, then took his hand. His camp was set up a mile away, tucked behind a rock ridge. There was a tarp for shade, a small fire pit, and a bedroll laid out neatly. He poured her another drink and handed her a biscuit from his saddlebag. They sat on opposite sides of the fire as dusk turned the sky orange. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. "Used to be I worked cattle. Got tired of ranchers and their tempers. These days I catch wild horses, sell them to the army. Pays decent if you do not mind the dust." "You always help strange women in the desert?" He smiled, slow and easy. "Only the ones wearing white." She laughed once, a dry sound. "I must look ridiculous. You look like someone who got a raw deal and kept going anyway. That is no small thing." Silence settled between them. Then she asked, "You have family?" "My father was a mean drunk." Ma tried, but she could not hold him back. "I left when I was 15. Been on my own since." "That is a long time to be alone." He stirred the fire with a stick. "You get used to it." She did not speak again until the stars came out. Her voice was soft. "What are you going to do with me?" He looked across the fire at her. "I am going to bring you somewhere safe." You can rest up, figure out what you want. I will not leave you out here. She nodded slowly, her eyes shining. Thank you. He stood and laid out a second bedroll. Get some sleep. We will ride out at first light. She lay down, watching the firelight flicker against the rocks. Tobias sat beside her, rifle across his lap, keeping guard. As she drifted to sleep, she whispered, "You are the first person who did not look at me like I was broken." His voice came quiet through the dark. That is because you are not. You are just not finished yet. And for the first time in days, Olivia slept without fear. The morning began with a hush, the kind of quiet that settles over the land before the sun fully rises. Olivia woke to the smell of mesquite smoke and a pan scraping gently against iron. She sat up slowly, her ribs aching from the hard ground, and saw Tobias crouched near the fire, turning something in a skillet over glowing coals. You cook. Her voice was hoarse with sleep. He glanced over his shoulder. Only what keeps me alive. You like eggs? She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I haven't decided. No pressure, he said, lifting the skillet and setting it aside to cool. They're mule deer eggs, if that helps. She raised an eyebrow. He gave a faint chuckle. Kidding. Hen eggs. Traded for them in Tubac 2 days ago. She reached for the tin plate he handed her, fingers brushing his. The eggs were overcooked at the edges, but warm and more comforting than she expected. She ate in silence, watching the light spill over the distant hills. How far's the nearest town? She asked, wiping her fingers with the edge of her skirt. Canelo's a half-day east, riding steady, he said, pouring a little coffee into a tin cup and setting it at her side. Not much there, but it's got a mercantile and a woman named Ruth who runs a boarding house. She don't ask questions. I'm not looking to disappear, she said, still on the horizon. Just figure out what's next. He nodded and reached for his saddle, checking the cinch. Ruth will give you room and a roof while you think. I can swing back in a few days, bring word from the station if you want to wire someone. No one left to wire, she said. But thank you. He paused, one hand resting on the saddle horn. There's work if you're not afraid of it. Ruth needs help with laundry and cooking. School teachers due in July might be a place for someone with proper handwriting. I've got decent penmanship, she said, blinking against the wind. And I know how to read. Then you'll do just fine. He turned to his horse and hoisted the saddle up, leather creaking. She gathered her things, what little she had, and brushed dust from her dress as best she could. Tobias. He looked up. I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come along. He adjusted the bridle, gaze steady. You would have lasted. You've grit. They rode east through the heat, the sun climbing slow behind them. Olivia sat side saddle, her back straight despite the ache in her spine. The countryside changed as they moved. Yucca forests gave way to stands of cottonwood, and the dust turned to red clay. A jackrabbit darted across the path ahead, and Tobias slowed his horse, letting Olivia's mare catch up. You ever been east of here? He asked. Not past Bisbee. My father said nothing good ever came from going too far one way. I went north once, he said. Thought I'd see Montana. Made it as far as Wyoming before the frost turned me back. Some rivers shouldn't be crossed alone. She glanced at him. You ever think about settling? He didn't answer right away. Sometimes. I've had enough running to last a lifetime. Just haven't found the place that feels worth staying for. She didn't speak again until the town came into view, just a scattering of rooftops and a church steeple rising over the plain. He pointed to a house near the edge of town, with a line of laundry snapping in the breeze. That's Ruth's. Olivia nodded, her mouth dry again, but not from thirst this time. They dismounted at the gate. Ruth came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was stocky and sun-browned, with gray hair pulled back tight. Well, she said, eyeing Olivia's dress. Looks like you've had yourself a time. I have, Olivia said simply. Tobias tied off the reins and stepped back. She's needing a place to land for a while. Told her you might be able to help. Ruth studied Olivia a moment longer, then gave a single nod. Come in, girl. I've got a room upstairs. You can start with supper dishes. Olivia hesitated, then looked back at Tobias. Will you come back? He met her eyes, quiet. If you want me to. She gave a small nod. I do. He tipped his hat, then swung into his saddle and rode off without another word. Ruth opened the screen door. He always leave like that? I don't know yet, Olivia said, stepping inside. But I hope not. The back room of Ruth's boarding house smelled faintly of lye soap and cinnamon. Olivia unfolded her dress across the bed, the once elegant fabric dulled and creased. Ruth had given her a calico apron and a pair of soft-soled shoes that didn't pinch. The shoes belonged to Ruth's sister, who had passed on 2 winters ago. Olivia hadn't asked about her. Ruth hadn't offered more. The days passed with a quiet rhythm. The boarding house filled with travelers, stagecoach men, a fur trader with a stiff leg, and a widow with 2 grown sons who spoke in low tones and watched everything. Olivia kept her head down, washed linens, swept floors, and learned to make biscuits that rose tall in the pan. Her hands toughened and her mind grew still in a way it hadn't been for a long while. Tobias didn't come back that first week. She didn't ask Ruth if he would. She starch-pressed pillowcases and poured coffee at dawn, and when the desert wind rattled the shutters at night, she let herself imagine the sound of hooves instead. Late one afternoon, she stood on the porch, peeling apples into a tin bowl when the sky shifted. A low rumble carried across the plain, not thunder, but something steadier. She paused, knife in hand. A horse came into view, dark against the pale road. The rider sat tall, his hat tipped low. She recognized the shape of him before she saw his face. He dismounted without a word and tied the reins to the front post. "You're late," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. He looked at her, the corners of his eyes lined deeper than she remembered. "Got held up near Fort Huachuca. They lost a horse, I sold them. Took some convincing I wasn't to blame." "You didn't wire," she said, quieter now. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box wrapped in cotton cloth. "Didn't have time. Found this at a trading post near Sonoita. Thought it might suit." She took it carefully, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a hair comb carved from polished wood. Simple, strong, with a single turquoise bead set at the center. Her fingers brushed the bead, then closed around the comb. "Thank you." He looked down at his boots, then back at her. "You doing all right here?" "I'm managing. You look stronger. I feel it." He stepped closer, dust streaking his coat sleeves. "I've got a line on a small place west of here. Couple acres, needs fencing. Owner passed, son wants it off his hands. I could make something of it." She watched him carefully. And I've been thinking about why I kept writing back this way. Wasn't just to check on you." The apple in her hand slipped into the bowl with a soft thump. She didn't move to pick it up. "I've known men to say things they didn't mean," she said. "I've said enough to know the difference now." She stepped down from the porch, the hem of her apron brushing his boots. "You're not the only one who's been thinking." His breath came out slow. "Olivia, I'd never ask for more than you're willing to give. But if you wanted to walk beside me, I'd be proud to build something with you." She slid the comb into her hair, smoothing the curls back from her cheek. "I don't want a rescue, Tobias. You never needed one." The wind lifted the edge of her apron, and the scent of sun-warmed cotton and horses filled the space between them. "Then yes," she said. "I'll walk beside you." He took her hand, just once, rough fingers folding around hers. Ruth watched from the kitchen window, a dish towel in her hands, her expression unreadable. When Olivia turned back toward the house, Tobias beside her, she gave a faint nod and disappeared from view. That evening, they sat together on the back steps, their shoulders touching as the sky burned low behind the hills. He said little and she said less, but the silence felt full instead of empty. As dusk deepened, Tobias reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded paper. "Found a man in Canelo who'll sell me that land. Needs cash by end of the month. I've got most of it, but not quite all. I've been saving my wages," she said without hesitation. "You'll have what you need." He looked at her then, truly looked, and whatever wall had remained between them slid quietly away. "You sure?" "I've never been more certain." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll build it. A home. A life." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move, just rested his hand lightly over hers. anchoring them both. The stars came out one by one, and the desert wind carried only the sound of crickets and the soft creak of the porch behind them. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something they would carve out together, steady as stone and just as lasting. The sun had barely cleared the ridgeline when Olivia tied back her hair with a strip of muslin and stepped into the raw morning air. A small wagon waited near the edge of town, its wheels mended and its bed empty save for 2 bundles of fencing tools and a coil of rope. Tobias stood beside it, tightening the yoke strap on the mule, brows furrowed in focus. She approached with measured steps, her boots raising little clouds of red dust. "You still planning to haul that lumber today?" He glanced at her, then gave a short nod. "If I don't, it'll sit a week longer in that yard and the price'll only go up." "I can come," she said, adjusting the canvas satchel on her shoulder. "Ruth's sister-in-law arrived last night and took over the kitchen. I'm not needed today." He studied her a moment, then moved aside. "Climb up then. It's a rough road down to the creek." The wagon jostled as they rolled out of town. Olivia held the seat rail with one hand, the other resting in her lap, watching the land unfurl in silence. Dry washes cut across the plain, and the occasional cluster of prickly pear marked the edges of old cattle trails. Morning birds flitted through the greasewood, and a coyote trotted in the distance, tongue lolling. Tobias broke the quiet after a mile. "You ever do any work with posts and wire?" "I haven't," she said. "But I've mended porch steps and helped shingle a roof once, when the preacher's wife took ill." "Then you'll manage," he said. "It's mostly rhythm. Driver digs, partner sets, and braces. Wire comes after." She turned to him. "You always work alone?" He shook his head once. "Not always. Just got used to it. A man doesn't argue with himself." "I might," she said, "if I think you're setting a post crooked." He gave a quiet sound, more breath than laugh. "Fair warning, then. I'll argue back." The lumberyard sat at the edge of a dry riverbed, the boards stacked under a canvas awning. A man came out wiping varnish from his hands, and Tobias pulled a folded paper from his coat, handing it over without ceremony. Olivia stayed by the wagon while they loaded, watching how Tobias tied everything down with methodical care. His movements were efficient, not rushed, as if he'd done this same work 100 times before. Once the wagon was full, he handed her a strip of dried meat and a canteen, then climbed back into the seat beside her. "We'll take the long way back." The cut near White Bluff washed out in the spring. They traveled through a narrow canyon, the shadows still cool on the rocks. Olivia shifted on the seat, then glanced sideways. "What made you want this place?" "That land." He didn't answer right away. "There's a stand of cottonwood near the creek. Water runs slow through there even in dry years. Ground steady. Not much, but enough to raise a few horses, maybe a garden." She waited. "I never had a place that was mine," he added. "Not really. Just moved through other men's land, other men's rules. Figured it was time to build something that didn't belong to someone else." Olivia looked ahead at the canyon walls narrowing around them. "My father used to say that land don't matter unless your heart's in it." He nodded once. "That's true enough." They reached the clearing by mid-morning, the sun already high and sharp. Olivia helped unload the boards, stacking them carefully in the lean of a cottonwood. Tobias spread out the tools: a post-hole digger, a rusted auger, and a battered spool of wire. They worked side by side, sweat beading on their brows. She dug while he tamped soil around the posts, bare hands bracing the wood until it held fast. The rhythm came just as he'd said it would: steady, quiet, purposeful. By the time the sun tipped west, they had finished one full row. Tobias poured water into a tin basin and handed it to Olivia. She dipped her hands, then wiped her face with her sleeve. "I didn't expect to feel proud of fence posts," she said. "They're yours now," he replied. "You stood them upright. That counts." She sat on a fallen log and watched the breeze move through the grass. "You think we'll have enough for the house before winter?" "We'll make it," he said. "Might be plain at first, but solid." She drew a line in the dirt with her boot. "You ever think about a family?" He crouched beside the tools, coiling the wire neatly. I've thought about what kind of man I'd need to be to raise one. Haven't quite figured it all out yet. You don't need to have it figured, she said. Just be willing. He looked up at her, and something unspoken passed between them, not heat, not rush, but quiet certainty. She blinked, then stood and brushed off her skirt. Let's get the mule hitched. Ruth said she'd save us something hot. They rode back with the sun bleeding through the sky behind them, their shoulders brushing now and then on the bench seat. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt different than before, closer somehow, like the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the road beneath their wheels. That night, when Tobias walked her to the boarding house door, Olivia rested her hand briefly on his arm. Thank you, she said. For what? For letting me help? For not treating me like I'd break. He looked down, then met her eyes. You're stronger than most men I know. And I don't say that lightly. She nodded once, then stepped inside without another word. Tobias stood there a while longer, hat in hand, the scent of fresh laid dust hanging on the air. When he finally turned to go, he did so with a heart that felt heavier, but not in the way it used to. It was full now with something real, something slow growing, like fence posts sunk deep into earth that would hold. By late July, the land Tobias had bought was taking shape into something that looked less like borrowed earth and more like a home. The frame of the house stood upright now, for walls bare and waiting for siding. The roof beams stretched overhead like ribs, open to the summer sky. Olivia stood inside what would be their kitchen, a hammer in hand, her sleeves rolled high and her hair wrapped in a kerchief to keep the sawdust out. Her hands had long since blistered and calloused from days of hauling boards and driving nails. Tobias was on the ladder, aligning the rafters with a carpenter's square he'd bartered for in Patagonia. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his knuckles were scraped raw, but she noticed he moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that came not from pride but purpose. You said you'd paint the walls pale blue, she said, holding a board steady. I will, he answered without looking down. Once we've got walls to paint. I've been thinking, she said, eyeing the shape of the doorway behind her. We ought to put a bench by the window with a cushion maybe. A place to sit and peel apples come fall. He paused, then glanced down at her. That window faces west. Sun'll warm it in the afternoon. You'll like that. I will. They worked until the light stretched long across the grass. When the last board was nailed in place for the day, Tobias climbed down and poured 2 tin cups of water from the barrel beside the wagon. They sat on the edge of the porch frame, legs dangling, watching a pair of quail dart through the brush beyond the fence line. You ever think about what you'd have done if that man hadn't left you? He asked, voice low. I would have married him, she said. Would have spent the next 30 years wondering why my heart never caught up. He turned toward her, his face in shadow. Do you regret any of it? No, she said, watching the horizon. Because it brought me here. He was quiet a long while. Then the man I used to be wouldn't have known what to do with a woman like you. She grinned. Then I'm glad I met the man you are now. A breeze swept through the cottonwoods and carried the scent of dried grass and pine. Tobias reached into his pocket and drew out a small ring wrapped in cloth. The silver band was simple, but the stone caught the last light of dusk, a deep green like river moss. My mother's, he said, placing it in her palm. She gave it to me before I left home. Told me to give it to someone who'd plant her feet in the same soil as mine. She curled her fingers around it and looked up at him. Then let's plant them together. They married under the open rafters 2 weeks later, with Ruth standing beside Olivia in a dress she'd sewn from dyed muslin and the trader from the mercantile reading aloud from a worn Bible. There were no pews, no choir, just the sound of wind and the creak of the boards beneath their feet. Tobias held her hand steady, his thumb running over the edge of her palm as the sun slid down behind them. When it was done, he bent his head and kissed her, soft and certain, and the world narrowed to the warmth between them and the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air. That fall, they finished the siding and laid the floors. Olivia painted the kitchen walls pale blue, just as she'd said she would, and Tobias built the bench beneath the west window from leftover cedar planks. Each board bore the mark of his hand and the weight of shared labor. He raised mustangs on the land, starting with 3 colts and a mare he'd traded for at the Sierra Vista auction. Olivia took to training them, coaxing their trust with oats and patience. She had a way of standing still near the fence until the horses came to her, as if they sensed something steady in her that they'd been looking for. In the evenings, she read aloud while Tobias cleaned tack or mended shirts. Sometimes they played cards on the front porch, their laughter drifting across the dry grass. Other nights, they sat without words, watching the sky turn to velvet. By the time the first frost came, the pantry was full with jars of peaches and jars of beans, and the hearth burned with mesquite and pine. The house stood firm against the wind, and the roof never once leaked. When spring returned, so did green along the creek, and with it, new life. Olivia's hands moved often to her belly, where quiet movement had begun weeks earlier. Tobias touched her only when she guided his hand, softening the lines around his mouth. "You think it'll be a boy or a girl?" he asked one night, his head resting against her shoulder as they watched the fire die low. "Doesn't matter," she said. "They'll have 2 strong hands and a place to belong." He kissed the inside of her wrist. "They'll have more than that." Years passed, not fast, but full. Tobias built a second barn when the herd grew. Olivia taught letters and numbers to the children from nearby homesteads each winter, her voice clear and warm in the little room off the kitchen. They grew older, their backs stiffer and their silence more companionable. But the love between them never dimmed, it deepened like water in a well drawn slow and sure. On their porch hung a horseshoe Tobias had nailed up the week they finished the house. It remained there still, weathered by sun and time, a quiet marker of where their story had begun and where it would always belong.